Hello, I'm Mark Boccuzzi, and I'm speaking to you today from Tucson, Arizona, where I live with my wife and research partner, Dr. Julie Beischel, and our two rescue pups, Ada Grace and Toggle. Before we jump into this presentation, I want to go over a few quick definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to use the word psi a lot, which is actually the Greek letter psi, and it's an umbrella term for phenomena which include telepathy or mind-to-mind communication, clairvoyance, which is any real-time information about a distant location, item, event, or person. This is sometimes referred to as remote viewing. Precognition, information about a future event. Retrocognition, information about a past event. And psychokinesis, often abbreviated as PK. And we break psychokinesis down into three separate parts or three different levels. Macro PK, which are large-scale effects which are visible with the naked eye. Micro PK, which are quantum-level effects. And bio PK, sometimes referred to as direct mental interaction with living systems, or DMELS. So the thing that's important to remember about psi, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis, is that these happen outside of our known motor sensory channels. Psi also seems to function in two modes. There's what we call explicit psi, which is the conscious effort that we put into acquiring psi information or causing psi effects. And implicit psi, which happens in the background outside of our conscious awareness. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The area of science that studies psi phenomena and experiences is known as parapsychology. I'm currently defining parapsychology as the multidisciplinary study of a set of experiences and phenomena that challenge our basic assumptions about the fundamental relationships between consciousness, matter, space, and time. I should say that this definition isn't widely accepted by the field, but it works for me at the moment. I should also mention that parapsychology not only studies psi phenomena, but has an interest in phenomena and experiences relating to the survival of consciousness after bodily death. This includes things like mediumship, near-death experiences, reincarnation, ghosts and hauntings, etc. So one of the first questions that comes up when you mention psi is psi real? Well, for the purposes of this presentation and talk, I'm going to say yes, it is real, but we don't fully understand it. I'm not going to spend any more time defending the existence of psi, and if you're new to these concepts or this field, there are a few books I would recommend to get you started. One Mind by Larry Dossey, Dark Cognition by David Vernon, Real Magic by Dean Radin, Transcendent Mind by Amance Baruch and Julia Mossbridge, and The End to Upside Down Thinking with Mark Gober. If you get through these 4 or 5 books, you'll have a good, solid foundation of the field, and they are wonderful jumping off points if you want to get into more specific areas or more technical details. So in this talk, I'm going to try to address this overlapping space between what we call applied psi, ethics, and activism. And when you interact with these three areas, it does tend to raise a lot of questions. And I'm going to talk about those issues today. And my goal here isn't to provide you with answers, but to give you things to think about as you put your projects together or you start working in this field more. And this is going to be a very high-level conversation. I'm not going to get too hung up on the details of research protocols or specific experiments. This is big picture stuff today. So speaking of big picture, I'd like to put forward this idea that you keep in mind this idea of whole systems or whole systems thinking, and not fall into the trap of compartmentalizing some very specific effect without thinking about how it interacts with the system, with the other parts of the systems. And I think this is especially important when we talk about psi and its effect on people, the environment, non-human animals, and the rest of the biosphere and geosphere. I don't think we can affect one of these things without impacting all of them to some extent. So try to keep that in mind as we go through these topics. All right, so let's talk about the ethical considerations of applied psi. For my work, I tend to break things into two categories. There's research that we conduct in the lab, and then there's application development that we conduct out in the real world. Now, laboratory-based research is expected to follow all local, state, and federal laws, but we're also held to a higher ethical standard. For example, if I develop an experiment that incorporated non-human animals, that experiment and those protocols would need to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACOC, before I could move forward. Something similar would happen if I were to develop an experiment that required human research participants as well. That would need to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Now, in application development, of course, we still need to follow all state, local, and federal laws. However, this adherence to a higher ethical standard, or the idea of ethics in business, becomes a little bit more murky, because just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. So for me, this creates a fundamental question right out of the gate whenever we start application development, which is, given the unique nature of psi, is a higher ethical standard needed for applications? So when I talk about ethical research, what do I mean? How do we determine whether or not a particular experiment is ethical or not? Well, there are 4 sets of criteria that are tested for every experiment. Those include autonomy, or respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and non-maleficence. And I'll go into detail about each one of these in a little bit. So how did we get to the point where researchers were held to this higher standard? Why do we need this extra level of ethical review when we conduct research? I want to just point out 2 quick examples from history that brought us to the point where we are today. The first is the Nuremberg Code, which was in 1948, and it was established after the trial of German physicians who willingly conducted deadly and crippling research on prisoners. It's the first international document which advocated for voluntary participation and informed consent, and we'll talk more about those things in a bit. And then from 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study was conducted. Here, 600 low-income African-American males, 400 of whom were infected with syphilis, were monitored for 40 years. Participants were actively denied treatment even after a cure was found in the 50s. So those are just 2 examples from history. If you want to know more about how we ended up in this place where researchers are held to this higher ethical standard, I'd recommend the book The Ice Pick Surgeon by Sam Keen. And it talks about a number of examples where researchers have given up their humanity in exchange for the pursuit of knowledge. I want to dig in a little bit more into these 4 ethical principles that are used to evaluate research. But as I do that, again, I want to remind you to keep in mind this idea of whole systems. And while these ethical principles were really drafted with human beings in mind, I think it's appropriate to consider their application across multiple domains. Let's go ahead and put some definitions next to these various principles, and we'll start with autonomy or respect for persons. Individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. Persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. In research, we accomplish this through a process known as informed consent. During that process, participants are told what is expected of them during the study, what data are going to be collected, and how those data will be used, that they have the option to opt out of the study at any time, and that they should be free from any sort of coercion. Beneficence. Research should maximize benefits and minimize harms. Individuals should be informed of risks and benefits before volunteering. Justice. Risks and benefits must be distributed equally. No section of the population should get special treatment. Non-maleficence is an obligation not to inflict harm on others. So let's see how these basic ethical principles can be applied to consciousness-based applications. In his book, Subtle Activism, David Nichol proposes the use of consciousness-based practices to facilitate collective change. Now, these practices include meditation, prayer, and ritual. Now, typically, these types of practices are used for personal development, so it's an interesting idea to try to apply them on a larger scale. There's one term I just want to make you aware of if you haven't heard of it before. It's called the Maharishi effect. And this is a set of experiments or interventions in which large numbers of people came together and meditated, and then they looked at things like crime rates or terrorist activity or violent actions in the areas where those large-scale hundreds, if not thousands of people meditated. And what they saw was that those areas showed a decrease in violence and in crime. And so there's been a number of studies that have been published over the years about the Maharishi effect. Now, I don't want to go into detail specifically about a specific study or the limitations or strengths and weaknesses of the protocol, but I want to take a look at these, the application of meditation, prayer, and ritual on sort of an operational level. So let's dig into that for a second. So on the ground, what does this look like? So as an example, let's say we have a city that has a rising crime rate, and we have a group of consciousness-based activists who want to help reduce the crime in the city through meditation, prayer, or ritual. So they might set a specific intention or desire or say a prayer to reduce crime by at least 20%. Now, we would say that that creates a form of consciousness field that then would permeate that location. And so that the next time they check the crime rates, and they find that there actually was a reduction in crime. So what does this mean operationally? Well, because of a psi intervention, resident behavior was altered in such a way that it reduced the crime rate. So reduction in crime rate is good, but how does this model hold up when we evaluate it using these basic ethical principles? Well, let's look at autonomy. The residents had no informed consent, and they had no way to opt out. This was something that was simply inflicted upon them. And some residents may have been morally opposed to being part of something that included a consciousness-based activity. So for those reasons alone, the autonomy test fails. It's also difficult to measure or assess risks versus benefits given such a narrow metric as crime rate. There was nothing else that this study looked at to help understand the impacts of this intervention on other parts of the population, whether it be the residents or the meditators. Also, did all the neighborhoods have equal burden? And do all the residents have equal access to care and support should they need it? And since psi still isn't fully understood, there may be yet unknown harmful impacts. So overall, this intervention doesn't stack up well when we use basic ethical principles as a litmus test for its viability. However, even though this doesn't pass our ethical litmus test, there are actual benefits from a reduced crime rate in a location. For example, it lowers the costs to the city, it increases property values, and it increases the quality of life, at least for some of the residents. So this raises a bigger question. Although it may not be ethically sound, do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to deny someone's autonomy if it serves a greater good? So the question becomes, for me, can these types of ethical principles coexist with the application of meditation, prayer, and ritual? Or do we need to consider something else? Let's move on to the next topic, which is the implicit and explicit nature of psi. In this example, we have a group of consciousness-based activists who are interested in an intervention involving meditation, prayer, or ritual. And in this case, they've set a specific intention to form, to increase the sense of community in a given location. This agreed upon intention would be an example of explicit psi. Everyone in the group is committed to a specific outcome, and they're putting their mental focus on that outcome. However, in the background, we may also be experiencing implicit psi effects. These are effects that are caused as a result of a person's deep-seated needs that they may not even be consciously aware of. So in this case, maybe there's someone in this group that doesn't particularly feel comfortable with all the people in their community. So there's a conflict between their implicit needs and their explicit intent. And when that happens, does that form some sort of confound or create a confound in the intervention that we're trying to create? This all leads to another question. Are trained and enlightened practitioners needed? Can we really expect people off the street to have clarity of mind if they haven't been properly trained to understand the differences and conflict between their implicit needs and their explicit intentions? So the next topic I want to talk about is respect for whole systems. Some of you might be familiar with this book, The Intention Experiment by Lynn McTaggart. And if you've read that book, you may see my name sprinkled around in various chapters, especially those dealing with the effects of intention on plants. After co-founding the Windbridge Institute, I continued my own personal exploration of this idea of intention on biological systems, specifically plants. So I engaged a number of healers and meditators to send growing intentions to plants in the lab. And what we found was that there was actually evidence to support the idea that this focused intention did increase plant growth. However, the plants that were targeted by the intention also required much more watering, and they wilted and died faster. So this brings up yet another question. What are the implications for the environment, infrastructure, and resource management if we were to employ these types of interventions on other types of biologicals at scale? What happens to the other systems that utilize the resources that these intention targets would be utilizing? Weather is another complex system that affects us all the time. And throughout history, we've heard all kinds of reports about people being able to affect the weather or request rains or bust clouds. But it was only relatively recently where we had the technology to track those effects. So I went through a number of examples, and I cherry-picked one that I thought would make my point about the impacts of psi on complex systems. And this one has to deal with prayer, and specifically it's Pat Robertson prayed that Hurricane Gloria would move away from Virginia Beach back in 1985. And while the hurricane did not actually impact Virginia Beach, it did change trajectory and hit Long Island instead, and this resulted in 8 deaths and over $9 million in damage. The carbon cycle is another really complex system that exists in our world. So what are the implications if we insert psi into that system? Are we actually solving problems, or are we simply passing them along to someone else, like the hurricane that hit New York? So the next topic I want to touch on is this idea of activism versus slacktivism. So slacktivism has been defined as the desire people have to do something good without getting out of their chair. And I envision consciousness-based activism today to include a lot of possibly online or in-home activities, whether it's people meditating on their own or using apps or getting online to participate in some sort of group activity. And then once those consciousness-based actions are completed, then the activists would go back and participate in the rest of their lives. What's interesting is that recently Brookings published an article in which they stated that about 2/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are linked to household consumption. So what that means is the possibility that once a consciousness activist has completed their activities for the day and they go out and go around performing their regular tasks and activities, they could potentially undo all the good that they've done through their activism. So the question now becomes, do we have an obligation to encourage consciousness-based activists to engage in real-world actions that reduce their carbon footprint? And that may take the form of education or other kinds of programs that allow them to take an active role so that they don't undo all the good that these programs may be doing. So this next topic is kind of personal, and it's a tricky one, and it's this idea of openness and open access versus covert action. And as scientists and researchers, our tendency is to want to make things open access and available to everyone and engage community and get information into the hands of the people that need it. However, given the nature of this kind of work and the current state of the world, an argument could be made that some, if not all, of these activities may want to be kept quiet and confidential. I also want to add to the mix that there's a growing trend where scientists are actually being targeted and threatened, especially climate scientists. So we may be creating this sort of perfect storm of this combination of consciousness-based interventions, which may actually be infringing on people's sense of autonomy, along with the controversial area of climate research. While a fundamental principle of research is transparency, given the current culture, should applied climate-focused psi programs consider enhanced confidentiality and security? So to wrap this up, how do we navigate these questions and this space? What tools do we have available to us that can help us better understand how our actions are impacting these whole systems that we talked about? So we do have some tools available to us from science. We have our list of basic ethical principles. Spirituality gives us concepts like karma and the harm none doctrine. Even the Bible has something to say about applied psi. For example, Deuteronomy states, "Don't try to use any kind of magic or witchcraft to tell fortunes or to cast spells or to talk with spirits of the dead." So the advice from religion is don't do it at all. We can also look to existing organizations and practitioners for some kind of guidance. For example, in the book The Premonition Code, Teresa Chung and Julia Mossbridge outline a positive precog code of ethics, and other organizations like the American Society for Dowsers and the International Remote Viewing Association both have code of ethics on their individual websites. Since we're engaged in consciousness-based activities, we may be able to draw upon consciousness-based tools. There are some traditions that suggest performing a divination before taking any action so that you can better assess the impact and outcome of those actions. So tools like tarot cards or pendulums may provide unique insight to some practitioners or researchers. We also may be able to use different types of technologies. For example, Choice Compass is an iPhone app that lets you measure your physiological response when you contemplate different questions. For people that need a more methodology-based or controlled tool, maybe things like associative remote viewing might provide certain insights to determine courses of action. To wrap this up, here's a summary of the questions that keep me awake at night when I contemplate the application of psi to climate action. Are the ethical principles used in research compatible with consciousness-based activism? Can we account for the implicit nature of psi? Can we ensure we are respecting the complex systems that govern our planet? Are we obligated to encourage practitioners to engage in tangible, real-world climate-friendly activities? Can we balance open access, safety, and security? What guidance will we employ to assess the ethical and practical impacts of our activities? I'd like to end with this quote from Albert Einstein. "Most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character." Some quick acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Dr. Julie Beischel, my partner in all things, Annalisa Ventola, and the other volunteers at Public Parapsychology that helped put this event together, Dr. Julia Mossbridge for her general support, and despite having a crazy schedule of her own, has the intuitive sense to keep me on my schedule, and the Windbridge Research Center and the Windbridge Institute for providing me with the time and resources to put this talk together. And of course, all of you for listening. Thanks.